Well, this is Joe Markowitz with my friend Chris Harris, Executive Director of Unhyphenated America, and myself, creator and founder of Defender Gear. Glad to be able to share with you all today, Chris.
So
glad to have you down here in our home, actually, in this time of stay-at-home orders and quarantines, and you covertly came in the middle of the night, snuck in here.
Had a little bit of rebellion right there,
Yeah, you made it anyway. We're excited about this next section here of our vlog. We're gonna get into I think very relevant current events. We get a chance to just jam a little bit, dialogue a little bit about topics in and around what is very near and dear to our hearts, and that is the greatness of America, our founding fathers, the principles that established this country, the blessings of liberty and freedom, but also the risks and the attacks against our freedoms and liberty. And we're very passionate about these things. My friend Chris here, as Executive Director of Unhyphenated America, I think going on at least 10 years now, from the DC area. He's an entrepreneur, also does a lot of work in the tech industry, but what he also is really motivated by and what he's very active in right now is, from his perspective, educating people about not only the way they think and believe, but also from time to time will go up against some people that disagree with him significantly in political arenas. We'll touch upon that. We'll let him go over his background a little bit, what he's passionate about. For me, myself, over 3 decades as a business owner, I own multiple companies, and my passion to start Defender Gear was far beyond just having an apparel company, which I think we've got some really cool stuff, and it really echoes my passion and the message of freedom and liberty, and that this is worth defending and fighting for. But beyond that, the platform is about educating people on the origins of their freedom, what makes America different, what makes America special, what makes America exceptional. Far from being perfect, far from being free from blemishes and times in our history where very dark times, but overall, what's the alternative? What's the alternative? And I wouldn't want to live anywhere else other than America. We're grateful for our heritage. We're grateful for the men and women who have paid a great price so that you and I may enjoy the freedoms and our rights that we enjoy today. So the other thing I want to share with you is this, in all of my my writings, my blogs, our vlogs, social media, and everything in between, is that I endeavor to stay above the political arm wrestling. I want to stay away from that. I believe that our message is higher than political parties. While I may address the ideology of certain politicians or political parties and challenge that thinking and that belief system, I still want to stay above it. I challenge it because I believe that ideology maybe or some of their political positions are contrary to what the fundamentals of America is. And what freedom and liberty is all about. And so I'll challenge it. And by the way, I will freely challenge anybody of any political party, right, left, middle, extremes, whatever. I will challenge that because in the end, we are all Americans. Which is a great segue to my friend Chris here, who I've known about Chris for about 3 or 4 years. You started following me over on Defender Gear. I said, who is this guy, Chris Harris, Unhyphenated America? So I started getting into his a little bit of his background and seeing what what he believes in, and he's also, you might recognize him, he's also been on Fox News, CNN, and many other media outlets. He is active politically, but he's kind of like me, that he wants to stay above the fray. He wants to speak in the realm of ideas, of principles, and I just think that makes a much better dialogue and conversation. I've never seen Chris get in an argument with anybody where all it is shouting. I believe that doesn't really help us intellectually. Unfortunately, a lot of people, they don't want to dialogue. They don't want to have an argument, make an argument. If somebody disagrees with me politically, I say, sure, I respect the fact that you believe the way you believe, but let's have a conversation. Make an argument for what you believe. And unfortunately, sometimes it ends up in just name calling, which is never a conversation starter. Being called a racist or a homophobe or xenophobe or all the phobes and all the names, that's just intellectual poverty in my mind. Let's make an argument. That's what Americans should be. We should be able to agree to disagree. The American political system, even our founding fathers, there was great disagreement upon to move towards the Declaration, which is an act of treason. The very act of treason that by putting your name on that declaration, those 56 signers, they knew exactly the risk. They had pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor on this principle that man should not live under tyranny. The very principles of freedom and liberty are something worth fighting for, and they believed it so deeply, so passionately, that they were willing to give up their honor, their names, their fortunes, even their very lives. And many of those signers did, Chris. They did end up giving their lives or die in prison. They lost their families. Many of them lost all their properties, their businesses, their names. They really gave up an awful lot. We believe that. I have some famous quotes that I want to be able to share in this conversation here today. But getting back to the disagreements, that there was, even in those in that summer of 1775 and 1776, those heated arguments that extended for months and months. And this was already, while the colonists were already shedding blood against the most powerful military in the world. That the shot heard round the world really began things, and there was a lot of blood spilled already. By the time these delegates gathered, represented 13 colonies in Philadelphia. And so there was a lot of disagreement over how far they wanted to go. What words matter.
Yes, they do.
And in that declaration, and once they put their signature, starting right at the top, big and bold, John Hancock, and they put their signature on that document, that is an act of treason. And surely we'll either hang separately or we'll hang together. I mean, there's a lot of reflection on the fact that how solemn that occasion was, but how determined they were based upon what they believed. Our Constitution, 1787, it was the years following the Revolution. Already we had won the revolution against the most powerful military and government in the world. We had won our freedom, our independence. But already, as we got into 1785, 86, 87, in 88 and 89, there was already a lot of contention between the states about states' rights versus federalism. And I don't want to go down that path, but there was a lot of disagreement in this time. Disagreement is good. Intellectual discussions, even contentious arguments, make a case. I wish people today would really take that course. When they disagree with somebody, we'll make an argument. Have an adult conversation. You feel strongly about something, make your case. You don't have to resort towards name calling, threats, burning down a campus, hurting people or threatening people. You don't have to resort to that. Those are all conversation enders. We should engage in intellectual dialogue and even differences that lead to arguments, but arguments not based upon name calling or personal attacks. This makes us better when we engage in these conversations to make our society better, to really think about the higher calling. And like I said, it's a perfect segue. Chris and I, while I've known about Chris for a few years, he's known about me and probably knew me a lot better than I knew Chris for about 10, 12 plus years. Me as an entrepreneur, Chris and his background, where he came from, we came together because of some common beliefs and principles. But this man right here, with Unhyphenated America, has, it's pretty common that he'll get threats, he'll be attacked for his beliefs, he'll be attacked because he has the courage to be able to talk about the things that really matter. And he'll go against certain belief systems that are all about victimhood, control, even, may I say, socialism, yes, government overreach. He will challenge that on the basis of our principles of liberty and freedom. I'm going to let Chris kind of take it away from here and tell us about yourself and talk about the stand that you're taking, the courage that you've had to have, and sometimes the risk of you being black as a conservative who's a Christian, and you're very bold about your beliefs and not afraid to challenge people. So, Chris, take it away.
Thanks, sir. I appreciate that. Once again, I'm Christopher Harris, the Executive Director of Unhyphenated America. And people always ask me, well, what does that mean? What does your organization mean, Chris? And I say, well, it's really simple that we understand, we embrace the beliefs of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And as we tell people, when you embrace those beliefs, those foundational beliefs this country was founded on, as Joe's talked about, is that, then you're an American, and that there's no need for any prefix or suffix. You're just an American. And it's really the only place in the world that is not an entirely homogenous nation that allows you to become a member, to become a citizen without really having to have been of a particular ethnic group. And it's something that's unique to be protected and preserved, to defend it, if you will, is one of the reasons why I'm such a big fan of what Joe is doing with Defender gear. But yes, I've received threats from people. I've had people mail things to my home, sometimes a little passive aggressive, but of course I've gotten emails. I've had all these people come at me and they've made threats to my family. There's always a threat to my livelihood. And the simple reason is why, as Joe said, is because I'm taking a stance against what's now become conventional thinking, is that you're supposed to be a subject to the government. I wholeheartedly refute that. But one of the things I like to do is to have a conversation with people. I mean, I'm not a confrontational person, and I'm more concerned with how you think. And I ask you, what do you think? But I really want to know how you think. How did you come to that conclusion? And it's interesting because asking people that question seems to, you would think that I'm attacking someone simply by asking them that question. Well, what do you think, and how did you come to that conclusion? They will call it the Socratic method, to ask people that question. I always want to know, well, what's your end goal? See, we can have a conversation, we can have disagreements, and as the founders and framers did, mainly because their core desire was to have liberty. How to go about doing it? No, we can argue all day long about how to increase liberty, excuse me, but the goal is liberty. I always want to know from people, well, is your end goal liberty? If not, then we really need to talk about this. What does liberty even mean to you? What's the difference between freedom and liberty? Do you understand that there is a difference between freedom and liberty? And I look at myself more as someone who likes to educate and inform people. But I've come to realize that we can't even have a debate until we first define terms. And we can talk about what's going on in America today. And one of my hot topics I love to talk about is the subject of socialism. And there's a lot of people who think that socialism, and you see those man on the street interviews, and they'll go out there and stick a camera, hey, what do you think about socialism? And there's a lot of people, mainly in younger generations, who think that socialism simply means to be sociable. And it's like there's nothing further from the truth.
Or fairness. It's all about fairness, right?
Yeah.
And it's fair that it's unfair for some people to have more than others. You're unloving, you're hateful if you're not looking out for your fellow American.
Absolutely.
Is that right?
Oh, that's exactly what people think. And then of course you have people who do. One of the things that we talk about with Unhyphenated America is that we fight against identity politics. There's a group of people out there who seek to separate people based on check boxes. And there's setting male against female, setting black against white, older against younger, rich against poor. And the only reason they're doing that is because they know if there's that contention that will allow them to gain more power. But when you realize that, first of all, as the founders and framers talked about, is that we were all created equal. Created equal does not mean that you will have equal outcomes. There's a lot of people who begin with this faulty premise that you're supposed to have these equal outcomes. No, you have equal intrinsic value in the eyes of your creator. That God does not view me as less than Joe because I'm black, and he does not view me as greater than Joe because I'm black. There's people, it's interesting, there's black people who, there's a narrative out there among a lot of black people that there's something inherently superior about black people. And there's people who believe that white people are inherently inferior or evil or whatever. And I'm like, okay, let's talk about truth. Let's talk about what are the definitions of words. How did you come to that conclusion? I just had a young lady on my Facebook page get into an argument with me, and then she ended up blocking me. She made the statement, Joe, that, she used some profanity, but she basically said that white people don't trust her, they don't believe in anything that doesn't support them, that is not in their interest. And I asked her the question, well, that's interesting, where'd you get that from? And she ended up talking about COVID-19 eventually, and she was saying, oh, well, it's COVID-19 is killing more blacks. It's largely the majority of the people dying from COVID-19 were black. And I'm like, well, that's not actual truth. See, we got to get into truth. The numbers say differently. There's a difference, and this is where definitions come in. There's a difference between something being a larger proportion versus being a majority. The majority of people dying from COVID-19 are not black. There might be a higher percentage, a higher proportion of black people dying from COVID-19, but then we can get down and say, okay, well, why do you come to this conclusion? Why do you think this is? There are things that we all know, that there are lifestyle choices that people have that lead to them being more prone to being affected by certain illnesses. Where did that come from? That's culture.
If I may, and hold that thought, it has a lot to do with having, because your belief system already predetermined outcomes that you now are looking for inputs to validate those outcomes. Well, COVID-19 kills more black people. Therefore, it's the white guy's fault, right? They want it, there's more poverty. Well, why is that? It's because of inequity, or it's unfair, or hate, or racism, or whatever. Finding arguments to back up your predetermined worldview that you won't change unless your belief system change.
Well, in every economic fallacy, begins with a faulty premise, right? It begins with the idea that there's only one pie and it's only so big, and therefore, if Joe happens to have, I mean, I always go back to like an example when you were kids growing up. Maybe it was pizza night, right? Mom, dad ordered a pizza. You had, it's a family of four, and maybe you're the youngest. Your older sibling got, 2.5 slices of pizza and you didn't. Well, there's a finite amount of pizza. They got a bigger piece, therefore you were deprived of it. And this is the mindset that a lot of people carry going forward. They think that the pie is only so big, and therefore if someone else has more than they do, then that's unfair. And then they also begin to take that and attribute that to certain things like race. And they say, oh, well, it's unfair that certain people, certain ethnic groups have more. And once again, they're going back with this bias that they've been taught that, well, I'm poor because I'm black and because my family were slaves. And one of my favorite things to do is talk to people and ask them, like, well, do you know about what happened like in the previous 100 years? Like, we've been, my family, like I said, I am, it's documented, I am the descendant of slaves. My 3 times great grandfather was born on a plantation in Virginia in 1813. He was able to actually purchase his freedom. But then what you have is, after 1865, emancipation, everything like that, what a lot of people don't realize, Joe, is that 50-year period from 1865 to 1915, that black people actually prospered. Was there Jim Crow? Of course. There were obstacles that were put in place. But believe it or not, black people went from basically about a 10% literacy rate to about a 40 to 50% literacy rate, which is incredible considering the fact that previously you were not even allowed to learn how to read. And one of the questions I always ask, well, why did they not want you to learn how to read? One of the books there, obviously, the book that most everyone had was they had the Holy Bible. Well, if you read the Holy Bible, and you comprehended what was in there, you begin to realize that you had an intrinsic value in the eyes of your Creator.
Right.
And if you have that understanding, then you'll stand against those who try to control you.
That's exactly right.
And this is one of the things they didn't want to talk about. And the people, as black people began to embrace that period from 1865 to 1915, we went from basically, owning nothing. And here's a little tidbit people don't realize. By 1910, 1915, there were about 10 million black people in the country, where there was about 4.5 million black people in the United States in 1860 census. And by the way, about 10% of them were free blacks. Did anybody ever tell you that? That's not part of the curriculum that they teach you. Why are they not teaching you that curriculum? Because they want you to believe that everybody was a slave. But then you realize 50 years after that, at the height of Jim Crow, black people went from owning nothing to owning 20 million acres of land. Now that's just a huge number. It's totally, they don't understand it. But here, let me give you some context. 20 million acres of land is the equivalent of owning the entire state of South Carolina plus Rhode Island and a little bit left over. That's what we went from. And how do we do that? By embracing the foundational principles: life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. We embrace capitalism and free enterprise. And that's why we had that success. And that success continued despite the barriers of racism, despite Jim Crow. That success continued for another 50 years from 1915 to 1965. And we continue to grow. Black people were prospering by embracing foundational principles, embracing that truth. But it was only after that point when we decided to, and there's a whole nother discussion about how we ended up there, but we decided to embrace a victim mindset. And what you've seen is a massive decline. The first thing that the victim mindset says that, you're black, you're in America, they hate you because you're black, you'll never be able to succeed, which was crazy that we embraced that mindset considering the fact that we actually saw the success. I was talking to my family, my parents, my aunts and uncles. They all grew up in Detroit. If you had seen or understood what Detroit was like in the 50s and 60s, there was a lot of prosperity. Everybody, more or less, grew up with a mother and father in the home. And I've had this conversation with my parents, my aunts and uncles. I said, why is it that you have allowed this narrative to be put forward that broken homes is the legacy of slavery? Why has that been pushed? It's not. It's not. That is the legacy of big government. When we decided to turn away from God, to turn away from foundational principles, to embrace these ideas that government will take care of you, that's what led to the decline, the degradation of the family, and everything else happened after that. This victim mindset that we have was cultivated. It didn't happen overnight. It takes a little while for it to happen, but when we started embracing that, everything went downhill from there. But I wasn't raised in that mindset, Joe. But I decided, it's funny, I started getting more around the culture, and people started telling me, well, Chris, things are not going right in your life right now. You know why? It's because of the evil white man. And because I was a little down on myself, I started to embrace that. Mm-hmm. And it was one of the darkest periods in my life. But one of the biggest things is that when I said, that's not how you were raised. You weren't raised to see yourself as a victim. And everything changed. Everything got better in my life when I said, no, I am actually able to control my actions by, one, changing what I put in my brain, changing my associations, and everything in my life has gotten better as a result of that. And everybody I know who's done the same thing has had the same results. It's all very predictable.
So you push against and challenge the mindset that you are stuck in life.
Absolutely.
Based upon your skin color. You challenge that because you have not only an identity as a believer.
Absolutely.
Because God does not see us as different or better or worse than another human being. 2 is that our declaration, even back our founders declared this, that they believe that all men are created equal. It goes without saying that it certainly didn't play out properly over the next 50, 60, 80 years, 90 years, and obviously the result of that and almost a judgment on this country was the Civil War, without a doubt. And it was a very painful time. But the fact is, getting back to when you ask questions, people who challenge you, maybe even say ugly things about you, try to paint you back into the collective. You're supposed to vote with us. You're supposed to believe with us. Come on. When you ask them questions like this, what do you want? Let's talk about economically. Mm-hmm. All right. Have you ever asked them economically, what do you want? What do they tend to go there with that? Well, somebody owes me something. Am I right? It's been unfair, so the government needs to give it to me. I need to be given more. Or, what if they said, I would like the ability to earn more? Be given more or earn more? I want you to talk about this. One has a lot to do with the dignity of mankind and really capitalism. Mm-hmm. B is you're trusting somebody else for your well-being, your livelihood, your family's economic future, and you have turned over control of your life to someone else, a collective, a government, or somebody that says, I will take care of you. One is all about human dignity. Another one is about dependency. Talk about that.
So I'm a big history fan, and those who know me and follow me know that I can hardly do an interview without mentioning a hero, my mentor from afar or from history, somebody I refer to as that dude, Booker T. Washington. And just to give you an idea, Booker T. Washington was born as a slave in 1856, right? He was emancipated like all the other slaves in 1965.
1865.
1865, thank you.
Yep.
In 1865, he was emancipated like all the other slaves. But by 1895, until he passed away in 1915, he was without a doubt the most influential black man in America, and actually the most influential black man in the world. And here was his whole thing, was talking about helping black people to come up from slavery. The core message that he was telling people was like, listen, for generations now, you have been worked, right? Because there are people, obviously, listen, when you've come from slavery, when you had people beating you, whipping you, and so on and so forth, you begin to look at work as a punishment. But the thing that Booker T said was like, listen, you have been worked like a beast of burden. Now it's time for you to learn how to work like a man, and that there's dignity in working like a man. And you know what it is what makes a slave? A slave is someone who does not own the fruits of their labor. That's what we did for 200 plus years. My ancestors were worked like beasts of burden, and they did not get to keep any of the fruits of their labor. All of a sudden now you're free. No one else is responsible for providing for you, even though when they provided for you, they really only gave you scraps. They're not responsible for providing for you now, but they're also not limiting what you can earn. And what ended up happening is that people realized, they embraced that. Next thing you know, you had this huge explosion in wealth, because that's where it comes from. It comes from your own work, owning your own work. And I ask people that today. It's like, how'd you like to, even let's talk about taxes. I ask people, hey, how would you feel about being able to keep your entire paycheck? Oh man, that would be great. I like to talk about those principal things because regardless of what your political affiliation is, I have not met a single person yet who has not said, man, it'd be great to keep my entire paycheck. So then we begin to ask the question, well, why are you getting so much of your paycheck taken? Well, it's because, the government needs it. Well, do they really need it? Do they need as much? And you start asking these questions. I like to take people down this path because what I've learned is that I can't go and tell you what to think. In fact, when I do that, you're going to reject it. All I can do is help you to discover it within yourself and just asking a few pointed questions. Why do you think this way? How did you end up here? When you got your first job, my first job, I was 14 years old and nobody told me about taxes, right? I think I was making $2.95 an hour or whatever like that. You worked 60 hours or whatever. You're expecting a paycheck, let's say $3 an hour times 60 hours. You're expecting a check for $180 and you end up getting a check for $150 and you're like, where's my money? Because you're doing the basic math. You ask yourself, so why was this taken away? And the difference between an employee versus an entrepreneur, and I always point this out to people, is that when you're an employee, you actually have your taxes auto-debited. Entrepreneurs have to pay taxes. And if you had to write out that check to government,
twice as much
yes,
versus an employee.
Twice as much.
That's right.
And if you had to write out a check, and it's interesting, when you become an entrepreneur and you have to write a check to government, you start asking yourself, man, they tell me that, well, we need government to fix the roads. But when you're out there driving and you see this, I keep hitting the same pothole on the same street. Why am I paying this money for taxes when this same pothole's been there for X amount of time? You start to ask questions about they say we're supposed to be paying these taxes to sustain the public education system. And then you sit there and go, well, these kids are not really getting any smarter. And you begin to question those things. They don't want us to question those things. They really don't want you to question those things because they don't have answers. There's a great quote from Thomas Sowell, somebody I admire greatly, an economist. And he said that much of the social history, he said this years ago, so he said much of the social history of the past 30 years has been replacing what works with what sounds good. My background actually is in the IT field. So I've been taught to think analytically, ask if-then statements. People will call, hey, can you fix my computer? Well, I already know there's only a handful of reasons why your computer's not working. Let's start with, is it plugged in? Let's start with those questions. And we realize that if we ask these questions, we follow some critical thinking, that we're going to find the solution. So I apply that same thought process. And I got to go back. I remember taking math in school, and I remember the teacher dinged me on a math test because I didn't show my work. And I was like, but I got the right answer. She's like, no, Chris, you have to show your work. And I was like, I got the right answer. What does it matter? And now in hindsight, I wish I could go back and talk to her and say, I appreciate you challenging me and making me show my work, because I might have got the right answer there, but that was kind of luck. You need to show your work so I can find out how you think. How did you arrive to this answer? And if you don't have the right thought process, and there is a proper thought process, there is objective truth out there, and truth is something that's outside of bias. It's demonstrable. It's using a scientific method to be able to determine how you got to this particular truth. When you do that, you'll more consistently get the right answer. But it begins with knowing how to think, knowing that there is truth, and that you can get to a particular result. And this is where I come back and I talk to the average black person. What do you want? As you ask, what do you want? Do you want a nice home? Do you want your kids to have a better education, so on and so forth? If that's what you want, how do you suppose you're going to get to that? And I let them tell me. And I said, okay, well, do you know someone who has achieved that? If they've achieved it and they follow this path, it's kind of like going through a landmine, right? A minefield. Probably it's in your best to follow that same path of success. And those, whether you're black, white, green, yellow, purple, doesn't really matter. You could have polka dots. There's objective truth. There's a path that you can follow that is no respecter of persons, that greatly increases the probability, and like there's no absolutes, right? It's not an absolute in that regards, but it greatly increases the probability and likelihood of you being successful. And it doesn't care about your ethnicity, doesn't care about your gender, doesn't care about any of those things. And that's one of the beauty of America. The beauty of America is that you can follow that success path and you can get the results. And nobody can take it away from you unless you vote for government who has a monopoly on force to take it away from you.
So you're up against forces, belief systems, ideologies that, whether they know it or not, are promoting dependency.
Absolutely.
And dependency is rooted in victimhood, is rooted in poverty, and you're dependent on your future and your livelihood based upon somebody else because you just don't know. But in your personal life, you have taught yourself and you've been around people that have taught you the principle of self-determination. Big difference between dependency and self-determination. Now you ascribe to a belief that says through a capitalism or through capitalism or free enterprise, about limited government, is that you don't have to depend on someone else to advance your life personally, professionally, economically. Your quality of life can be elevated based upon your effort, your time, your sacrifice. You should be rewarded for your effort. Now that is rooted in a belief that talks about self-determination as opposed to dependency. And to me, there's nothing in between.
Yes.
It's kind of like people would say, well, the government does need to provide some things. Yes, they do. And that is limited by the United States Constitution. However, in this crisis we're in right now with COVID-19, we're seeing firsthand how powerful the government can be. The federal government, state government, and even local municipalities have for the sake of safety, really made us extremely dependent. And for the first time in my lifetime, I am seeing where this is what socialism could look like. Now, let me pause right there because I'm really diving into something. You may say, here you guys go again.